In my first movie in this series, I talked about artificial intelligence and the way that ideas which seem reductionist and seem to sort of squeeze the excitement out of our world can actually be reversed to make the world more interesting. In the second one in the series, I introduced stories of virtual worlds being created. And two of them raise this interesting suggestion that we might be living in a virtual world. What might that mean? Now in this one, I want to talk about how one might interact with a virtual world. The limitations, the ethical limitations, and some of the implications which are quite interesting religiously. It becomes more complicated, not technically, but in terms of it requires more imagination, and it might be necessary to watch this more than once. First thing I would say is I see a sort of distinction between what you might call the movie director model of virtual reality. That is where, like the example I gave of, there is a box with my consciousness in it. And so you build around it a world that it can move around in and feel is realistic. And that, I point out, that's much more difficult than a movie, because in a movie you can just make sure the camera is in the right place and all that, so you don't see the satellite dish on top of what's meant to be Merlin's castle. But in a virtual reality, if there's an intelligent being in there and you've given me a room that I'm moving around in, it has to be pretty good, because I could take out a screwdriver and start dismantling things. And if I didn't find the right stuff behind them, I would know there was something wrong. I wasn't in a real world. So that was what put me off that sort of model, because there's so much to be programmed in to make it realistic. And yet I think that a lot of people sort of think of virtual reality that way, because that's a treatment it sometimes gets in the movies. I remember the first virtual reality movie. It came out before The Matrix. First one that I saw was called Open Your Eyes, a Spanish movie. And it was rather good, because there was this rich playboy who had a car and he crashed it disastrously. And he came round in hospital, and surprise, he wasn't too badly hurt. In fact, he was out of hospital and back to living his life fairly soon. Only something rather weird things started to happen in his life. And the story comes out that what's happened is that he's one of those people in the 80s who paid to be cryogenically frozen in the event of sudden death. The idea being that you keep the bodies frozen until medicine advances to the point when they can restore your body, and then you'll be unfrozen and come back to life. And this service added something extra. When you were frozen, it created a virtual reality, so you would go on, think you were going on living your ordinary life. The only thing, as I explained the danger of it, it was a bit buggy and it didn't work too well. Now, it was a rather neat story. And I think that a lot of people's impression of virtual reality is rather like that. You build a world that people will live in and think it's real. And I think The Matrix is a bit like that, what the machines had done was create a model of our existing world and put people into it so they would think they were living in the real world, but they weren't. Now, you see, that sort of world, the idea is if you have to give someone a history, there's someone in this world, so you have to sort of invent a history for them and leave the evidence of it lying around. Whereas I'm more interested in the sort of world where the person grows out of the history, it's left running. And this is typified by the example I gave of people wanting to test the scientific theory of everything. Put in those equations and run them with suitable starting conditions and see whether it forms universes, and if those universes form planets, and if on those planets life evolves, and so on. You see, in a model like that, you can't interact. Because let us say I wanted to go into that world to experience it with my body. Okay, you've got my DNA, you know what my body's made of, and you could do this sort of thing. You could create a model of me, put it in that world. But to do that, you would have committed the worst scientific sin possible. You would have done magic. Because in that world would now be a person, a real virtual human, who had no ancestors, had appeared out of nowhere, whose DNA didn't match any other genetic things on the planet. That's a miracle. So you have to think much more carefully about how you would interact. And I had this idea, which I played about in several stories, of let's call them angels, the beings from the real world, interacting with beings in the virtual world by riding them. I say, think of riding a horse. The horse is a real thing in its own world. It's a real animal. But you can get on it and you can, to the best of your skills, you can direct it and move it and make it do things. And I suggest that entering a virtual reality, that would be the best way to do it. To take a body, someone being born, that is in some ways compatible or you can relate to, or is the right sort of situation, and enter them like a sort of spirit. What would they sense? It would be like they begin to get the feeling that they're being watched over. There's something else there, and it sometimes can slightly guide them. Doesn't stop them being real, fallible human beings, with all the follies and the weaknesses, things like that, and the sexual desires and all that. But there is something there guiding, and that something is actually experiencing the world through their senses. Now, I wrote several examples of that, and one of them was in Words Made Flesh. I used it as an example to prove my point. And I did it a bit like Frank George did in the talk I told you about in the first episode, where he didn't just explain after intelligence, he sort of demonstrated it by presenting an argument which I saw as an algorithm for winning an argument. So in a similar way, what I did in this story is I gave the story in a certain way and presented in a certain way that what I could then say was, if you don't quite grasp how one could model a reality inside a computer structure, well, that's what I've done in your brain, because I gave you this story, and you, depending on how good a storyteller I am, you sort of lived it out. You lived it like a daydream. And so that's an example of creating a virtual reality in a computer structure which happens to be your brain. Now, the story I presented was one rather like the scientific model, but it had a spin to it. Something I must just point out is very important. Say the scientific model where you put in the conditions, the equations of our physical world. If these are the same equations of our world, it doesn't mean that the world that is going to evolve from them is going to be identical. That in that world there'll be a Ramsey Jukes now giving a talk to his computer and having it recorded. Because there's such huge complexity and it's such a sensitive thing that even the tiniest difference in the conditions could produce something very different. All you could expect is the sort of thing that scientists tell us we could expect from life on other planets. In other words, there are very good practical reasons why they might evolve into bipeds with hands that can do things and with a brain at the top and so on and so forth, and with spines and all that. But so there is a good reason. Don't be surprised if beings from another planet are in many ways rather like us. On the other hand, don't expect that. They could be something utterly weird. And it's like that with the world that grows out of inputting the theory of everything. You can't be sure it's going to be well, it certainly won't be exactly like ours. And what you're interested in is how much it resembles ours and sort of therefore can be taken as an explanation of our world. So the story that I present is basically of a scientific demonstration of the reality of these equations and the fact that you don't need God. They will just work out and create this world. But I had the spin that there's a sort of rivalry in this world between who I call the Minister of Technology, the War Minister, and what is actually the Minister of Religion, but he's called the Pope in this story. And the Minister of Technology is rather desperate to get one back on the Pope because he resents the fact that he's more popular with the masses and that sort of thing. So what he does is, well, it begins with the War Minister is demanding the financing of a massive super computer for military purposes, of course. That's the only way you get that sort of money, to protect them from invaders from outer space or whatever. So this is commissioned from the Minister of Technology, and he has an idea. He says, look, it's going to take several years of setting this up and commissioning it and everything. Can we do what we like with it while we're getting it running and testing it? Yes. His idea is, you see, he's going to do just that. He's going to put in the laws of physics and create a world and show the Pope, look, our laws of physics create a world just like ours. And so the Pope, through a screen as it's running, can watch incredible things. Wow, the Big Bang and this, that, and the other. It's amazing. But he's not totally convinced this isn't life. This isn't the real thing. That needs God. But life emerges on a planet, and it seems to grow towards intelligent life, beings rather like us doing things. And the Pope, he's not easily swayed. He says, look, I have to go into that world to judge if it really is like ours. And so he's allowed to choose and ride the body of and mind of a young shepherd boy in a small community. And he does that. And he spends a week or two in that time talking to them, discussing God, their beliefs, what they think about the world, living their life. And he comes away shattered. As he puts it, God has died for him. He now sees that this laws of physics produce a world which is really basically the same as ours. And so the great triumphant moment, the Minister of Technology calls in the media and all that sort of thing, and there's a big rah-rah with the king there and all the other ministers, and the Pope gets up and makes his speech to his flock saying, I'm sorry, after all these years I've discovered the truth, and so on. And then the Minister of Technology steps up and says, this shows the might of science, and we're always right, and so on and so forth. And now, at last, we can switch off this program and hand the computer over to the rightful owners, the Ministry of Defence, of War, and it can then defend our planet from... And the Pope says, hang on, you can't switch it off. You can't stop this program. Why? Well, because there are living beings in there, intelligent beings. Yes, but it's just a program. And the Pope says, from my experience going to that, God died. But I know where he is now. He's in your mind. Because you see a distinction between the world you created and our world that I no longer see. So the whole idea was that those two worlds should be absolutely comparable. But you still have this distinction that our world is the real one, as it were, the God-given world. And that world is just something we've made. And I say that's not valid distinction. We have an obligation to those beings in there. If you switch it off, you're not just destroying, it's not just genocide, you're destroying multiple worlds, it's multiple ecocide you're committing. You can't switch it off. The military can't have it. Now the king sees an opportunity here for getting a bit of public support, popular support, and so he says, I quite agree. And so the Minister of Technology and the Warminster are furious. But the Pope doesn't stop there. He says, look, I've been in this world. Terrible things are happening there. There's starvation, there's war, there's injustice, don't like that. We can't just leave it like that. We need a whole new generation of priests and people studying ethics in order to go in there and to try to improve this world. We have a responsibility. We can't just shirk it. And he says, to give an example of how bad it is, look, there was one country, they were enslaved, and people were so desperate. I saw a woman who had a newborn baby, and she put it in a little basket of bulrushes and left it floating in the river because she couldn't face the thought of it being brought up in this slavery situation. And I saw a princess of the royal family walking along the riverbank, and I did something which I know I shouldn't have done. I got the body I was riding to toss a pebble into the water, and it went splash. And that princess looked over the edge and saw this baby and took it and looked after it. Now, of course, ending like that, the suggestion is that virtual world is our world, and that was Moses, you see. So that made it a nice story. But it was an interesting example of, interaction and also some of the sort of moral problems. Yes, you can't really switch off a world if it really has grown in it intelligent beings, which, as the whole purpose is to show they're no different from us. You can't just kill them then. And it also shows the limitations of these interactions. There's another model I had, which was in another story, which may be in Words Made Flesh, I'm not sure, where the son of the man in charge of the project, the scientific project of just demonstrating the world as it is, the son is appalled by what he's seeing there. He's seeing again wars and starvation, this, that, and the other. And he says, we must do something. And the father says, no, we can't to interfere in such a complex system. You just can't predict what will happen. You could make things worse. You can't just do that. And so, but the son says, I must do something. And so what's decided is the son is going to be allowed to choose a place, somewhere that's sort of politically sensitive, that could make a big difference. Choose someone being born who's obviously intelligent and able and a good person to ride, and to go in there and ride this person and drive him towards being a preacher, preaching a gospel of love and forgiveness. So that really is the Jesus option. The Son of God who made the world moves in to preach a gospel. As I said, I said, just add a dash of hallelujah and you've got a whole new religion. Now there's another example. If I go forward to the very last time I think I made one of these stories up, I presented it to a group of pagans in Chester in the late 90s, I think it was, around about then. And I later wrote it up for a book, Liber Malus, which is a collection of essays based on around the theme of an apple, hence Liber Malus, which is, I think, available on Amazon. I should give you the contact details at the end. Now, this in this story, I add an extra factor, which I think it makes it very interesting. I call it the Cathar version, because the Cathars have this idea that, you know, whether God made the world or not, the fact is it's run by the devil, Satan, and really one of the Cathar decisions was that one should be celibate, not have children, because you don't want to bring them into this wicked world, this veil of evil. So in this world, it begins in a rather realistic scenario. You know how, in Britain at least, you tend to swing from times of big socialist government to privatisation and, you know, small government. Well, it's a time of big government, and there's government's got a lot of money, it's got a lot of good intentions, and it does just what I've been talking about. It creates a superb computer in which they can model, they can test scientific theories, like trying out the theory of everything and creating worlds and so on and so forth. And there's more to it than that, because actually one of the things the public's concerned about is genetic modification of foods. And you see, the fear that they could sort of, however carefully you do it, they could get out and cause disruption in the world. Well, if you've got a virtual world, which is rather like ours, but, you know, safely without population in it, human population, you could try out genetic modification in that world, and it would be perfectly quarantined. It would never affect our world because it's all happening inside this virtual model. Things like that. Wonderful idea. So they build this thing and it runs, and now, because it's a government project, very ethical, they realise the problem of you can't let it evolve into populations of intelligent beings, because that's a huge responsibility. So what they do is they sort of arrange that when what is clearly Homo sapiens like creatures evolve, they can arrange that they'll be infertile. So in other words, they won't breed and breed and breed and create a real problem. It stops there and they can be examined. And now, to make it a nice story, I made it rather unrealistic. Basically, I created a Garden of Eden situation where there was the one man, Adam, and the one woman, Eve, that had been created. They were intelligent human beings, and it was going to stop there. Now, in this story, the usual thing happens. The economy falters, the government's getting into difficulties, and this is becoming a bit of a problem, this big, massive project. Enter the evil media baron. He sees an opportunity, and he's prepared to do something wicked to get it. He goes to one of the programmers on the project and says, look, you're not being paid very much by the government. I could give you big money if you get me into that world. And they talk about it, and the person says, well, yeah, I mean, I can't put you in as you are for reasons I've given. You could enter as an angel or something, you know, or as an animal from that world. And the guy says, yeah, well, will that take long? It takes a long time, yes. It's a hell of a lot of programming to do something like that. Well, what's the simplest? I want something quick. Well, he says, you know, a snake's pretty simple. You could enter as a snake, but I want to be able to talk. Yeah, okay, I can make you a talking snake, and you can ride that. So that's what happens. He goes into this world riding as a talking snake. And he knows that there's a sort of emergency interface. People who go into the world to investigate and things like that, they have to have an escape route. There's a tree with a trapdoor in it, and there is an Apple computer. Nice. So he goes to Eve and he says, hiss, will you just open up that tree? And he opens up and there's a screen with a cut out apple on it. And there appears a picture of her, a movie picture of her. And he says, do you recognise who that is? And she goes, oh, 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 it's me. Yes, it's you, Eve. Can you see there's a little red button at the bottom of the screen? You could touch that. She said, well, I'm not supposed to touch the apple. Oh, no, nothing wrong. No, God isn't looking. Just touch that. And on it is written, activate puberty. So she touches it. Ooh. And the snake says, how do you feel? She says, ooh, I feel rather good. And the snake says, now look at this picture. Who's that? Oh, yes, that's Adam. Oh, look at Adam. And the snake says, would you like it if Adam felt the same way about you as you now feel about him? Oh, go and fetch Adam and get him to touch that red thing there under his face. And so she does. Puberty is activated, and as I said in the story, the rest is history. Now, you see, the reason this is being done is the great opportunity for the media magnate. He begins by saying, horror that suddenly, people in this world is suddenly developing rapidly, lots of people, civilizations rising like that. He says, what you need is private money. We can cooperate between the public and the private sectors on this. You need that support. This is getting really big. And what he has in mind, he begins by calling it education. If you have a child who is studying archaeology, history, all sorts of subjects, just think how fantastic that in 1 month he could live the entire life of a Neolithic hunter-gatherer in realistic situation. He enters into this world and pays a lot of money for it. If your daughter is studying women's studies, she could actually live out the life of what it feels like to be a prostitute in a shanty town in some poverty-stricken part of the world or whatever like that. Fantastic educational opportunities to live lives which would never have been possible. And so this becomes the thing to do. People entering this world to live it. And then it becomes entertainment. Thrill to a life as a Roman soldier. Conquer the world. Be a conquistador, finding South America, or whatever. And the same thing happens in the media. Every year they have to have bigger thrills. Iron Age, new, better weapons, bigger wars, more excitement. And then it comes up to World War II. You can live the excitement of a war that could be the end of all wars, or feel what it's like to live in a town that is going to be devastated by a nuclear explosion. And finally, live in the end times. You can be an eco-warrior in an age of global warming, and so on. And basically what's happening, you see, is that a world which has all the material to be a lovely heavenly place, beautiful nature, abundant resources, a lot of beautiful past and history and like that. This world is being constantly driven to produce new horrors. Crazy philosophies have been inserted into this world. Not just the word of Jesus, but a lot of crazy philosophies and ideas being inserted to make it big and dangerous and exciting, so that the people who we might call the angels can ride us and live out these thrilling things and learn from us. And in this story, this is the Cathar option. This is exploitation. We want to get rid of them. We want to be able to live our lives in this wonderful world that they have created, okay. But it's a beautiful world, it needn't be like that. A whole new religion, if you like. It's something that I want to write up in a book for a long time, but it's the implications of that. That'll be a future project. So what I've shown is that the whole business of interacting between reality and a virtual reality is actually not as easy as some people think. You aren't just sort of making a little world so that people should imagine that they're in it. That you actually got a lot of sort of ethical complications. It's a complicated business. You can't just fiddle around. And so that has religious implications. In my next video, I think I'm going to look at the magical implications of virtual reality, and this was what I majored on in Words Made Flesh.